On to the next agenda item of why do smart people believe in undirected macroevolution? Well, in the beginning of evolutionary thought, when the concept of evolution was birthed, there really wasn't much information. The microscopes were not really well designed. They didn't have much magnification power. We now have electron microscopes. The understanding of the universe is very limited, and in some sense it was the concept of the universe was based on philosophy rather than data. And the data about the atmosphere and environment of the early Earth were not known. And so there was lots of thoughts or theories about evolution in the beginning. They thought the cell was just a jelly-like thing called protoplasm. They thought there was an infinite and near infinite amount of time, and if there's an infinite amount of time, anything can happen. They thought that small changes could easily accumulate into big changes. They also thought there were a lot of resources in the early Earth. Well, it turns out, as we'll see, the simple cell is not just jelly, it's much more complex. We also now know that there's such a thing called the Big Bang, and there was not an infinite amount of time. We can see that in the cell, in terms of how the cell might evolve, that small changes don't easily accumulate into big changes. They usually lead to degradation. And there were not a lot of resources in the early Earth. The early Earth was very chaotic. So it turned out all of these ideas were all wrong. Not to say that these were bad scientists, it's just that we now have more data. At this point, we are starting to see some scientists publicly disagree with what we call undirected macroevolution. There's something called a scientific descent from Darwinism, where scientists claim they are skeptical of the claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged. At the moment, there's about 1,250 PhD scientists that disagree with evolution. Now, that isn't a large amount, but it is not to be ignored. The people could claim that these are all fundamentalist Christian scientists. They aren't. Some are atheists. An interesting aspect of this is that many are retired. It's really strange. Why would a scientist disagree with evolution after they've been retired and not during their career? Interesting data point. Now we're going to address something that is well known in the biology field, but not really considered by the layperson. I would say that mathematical models aren't useful in biology. If we talk about physics, we would say there's this equation that's well known: force equals mass times acceleration, F equals ma. Very simple, very universally applicable mathematical model. That kind of mathematical model doesn't exist in biology. We have this paper that I'd like to point you to. It's an opinion piece, but it's a very important opinion piece. The title is "The Reasonable Ineffectiveness of Mathematics in the Biological Sciences." The ineffectiveness of mathematics in biology. Why is this so? Well, biology is a statistical science in some sense. It's not a hard science. We don't see those very small equations like we see in physics or chemistry. And because of this, the accuracy of these models is not high. In fact, the models often leave room for interpretation and bias to creep in. For example, we're given the impression that genetics is a hard science. You know, we line up these two genes in the DNA, and we see this. Well, it turns out that the genes are statistically lined up. No two genes are identical. And so there's some fuzziness in this. Not to say that that data can't be used. It's just to say that it is not equivalent to physics. And so there's something we need to consider here. In the abstract, it says the known laws of nature in the physical sciences are well expressed in the language of mathematics. F equals ma, E equals mc squared. A fact that caused Eugene Wigner to wonder at the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematical concepts to explain physical phenomena. And then this is the important sentence. The biological sciences, in contrast, have resisted the formulation of precise mathematical laws that model the complexity of the living world. So we have no mathematical models really in biology. The world's very complex. Another quote from this article, it says, despite significant advances in many fields of biological science like systems biology and bioinformatics, both of which I understand, biology still lacks the kind of rigorous mathematical models we find in physics and chemistry. Again, just repeating, biology still lacks the kind of rigorous mathematical models we find in physics and chemistry. The fact that biology is not rich in theory is well known. Of the theories that do exist, such as Darwin's theory of evolution, most have never been formulated into mathematical laws. They are inexact generalizations. So what is these authors saying? They're saying that Darwin's theory of evolution is an inexact generalization. It is not precise. It doesn't fit into the same category as physics or chemistry. Why is this important? Well, mathematics isn't very helpful in biology. Mathematics is a key tool in most other sciences, but not in biology. So biological models and theories are crude. They are inexact generalizations. And because they're inexact generalizations, they can deceive the scientist. And because they deceive the scientist, they can deceive the layperson. Now, I'm not saying all findings that are labeled as science and biology are wrong or invalid. What I am saying is that they are inexact generalizations. Sometimes generalizations are helpful. Sometimes they can mislead. Now, later on, what we'll see in other modules, we're going to look at two rigorous mathematical models that exist in biology, and we're going to find that both of them do not point to undirected macroevolution as being the mechanism for the existence of life. These criticisms we'll look at are fairly old, and they have never been refuted as far as I can tell. The next observation we make is very general. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary or career depends upon his not understanding it. This is by a gentleman named Upton Sinclair. If we were to paraphrase that, because men are biologists, we could say, it is difficult to get a biologist to understand something when his salary or career depends upon his not understanding it. Now, consider this for a moment. Let's say I'm a young man, I get an undergraduate degree in biology, I do a master's, I do a PhD. I've invested a decade's worth of school into learning about biology. And the one thing that you learn is just, let's assume you absorb this, is that you cannot criticize evolution. Or if you do, it will end your career. Now, this is quite the charge I'm making, but it is true. I know of PhD candidates in biology who could not talk against evolution for fear of their career. I know of assistant professors in colleges that were denied tenure because of their views on evolution. It wasn't that they were Christian fundamentalists, it's that they thought that evolution could not explain life. Well, imagine the self-censorship that goes on here, right? If I have a wife and kids and a mortgage, as a biologist who's in the field, and I depend on my peers for acknowledgement and credit and grants and jobs, I will never, ever speak out against biology because I have other responsibilities. If you have bills to pay, this can influence what you're willing to investigate or concede to. I have written scientific papers in a systems biology journal. Now, if a biologist who is reviewing this thought that I didn't believe in evolution, they probably wouldn't have allowed those papers to be published. There is censorship in this particular community. Self-censorship and outright forceful censorship. So we cannot expect practicing biologists to say evolution is true. Here's another general observation. If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. This is by Joseph Goebbels, who is the Reich Minister of Propaganda. This is a well-known saying. Biologists are people, so we say if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, biologists will eventually come to believe it. Now, I'm not saying that biologists are Nazis. I'm not saying that biology leads to Nazism. I am saying that this Minister of Propaganda has a truism here that if you make a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. Why? Because people assume repeated phrases from authorities are true. Not all of us can go and investigate everything about biology, and so we assume those who have PhDs or are leaders in the field that what they say is true. Now, if you don't believe this can happen, I'd suggest you go and research the Asch conformity experiment, which proved this very thing. There's another concern about why people might believe in evolution is that they don't know the weaknesses of evolution. Why would they not know the weaknesses of evolution? Because the warts of evolution, the gaps in the evolutionary theory, are not discussed. The community of biologists may not want to air their dirty laundry because that would leave them open to criticism by people who think differently. Stephen Jay Gould was a proponent of a different style of evolution called punctuated equilibrium. So he was putting forward something different than undirected macroevolution. Well, Darwinian undirected macroevolution. He said, but most of all, I am saddened by a trend I am just beginning to discern among my colleagues being, I'll say, biologists. I sense that some now wish to mute the healthy debate about theory that has brought new life to evolutionary biology. Let me paraphrase for you. I sense that some biologists want to stop debating about punctuated equilibrium. Why? His next sentence is, it provides grist for creationist mills, they say, even if only by distortion. Perhaps we should lie low and rally around the flag of strict Darwinism, at least for the moment, a kind of old-time religion on our part. There's a lot of sarcasm here. Stephen Jay Gould, who thought of this punctuated equilibrium theory, says that the community doesn't want to discuss it because if they point out the warts or gaps in evolutionary theory, then all the creationists, those evil creationists, will jump up and say, evolution is wrong. And because of that, we shouldn't debate punctuated equilibrium. So, biologists may purposely stifle debate about evolution's flaws. Why? Because they fear creationism will be smuggled in. Now, there's the possibility of what I'll call just plain willful denial. I'm not saying that all biologists are this way. We're just exploring the range. And this is important for the next section. This is a quote by Thomas Nagel from an article called Evolutionary Naturalism and the Fear of Religion. And I'm very impressed by his authenticity here. In his quote, he says, I want atheism to be true. He's an atheist. And I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. He continues, it isn't just that I don't believe in God, and naturally I hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. The key phrase there, I think, in all of this honesty is, I don't want there to be a God. And so, if we were just to go a little further, it would be that atheists don't want God to exist, so they are willfully and purposely blind to any evidence that he may exist. Well, that strikes out a whole bunch of competition to the evolutionary theory, the undirected macroevolution. Now, this next quote we're going to look at is we're first going to look at a simplified version of the quote. It's like the appetizer, and then we're going to look at the actual quote, which would be the main course, because the main course is quite meaty, just to be honest. And this is all about, in a sense, personal bias. This first version was an interpretation by Grok. I didn't tweak it. I didn't do anything. I just asked Grok to make it simpler for a first-year university student. This is what Grok came back with. We'll look at the original. Just want to introduce you to this. The quote says, scientists sometimes believe really weird things that don't make sense at first, like how tiny invisible bits make up everything, or how the Earth goes around the sun even though it looks like the sun moves across the sky. But scientists stick with those strange ideas anyway. Why? Well, because they have already decided that everything in the world is made only of stuff we can touch, measure, and see, like atoms, energy, and rocks. And nothing magic or from God is allowed to explain things. It's not that science forces them to think only about real stuff. It's the other way around. They start by saying we're only going to look for answers using real stuff. So they build all their experiments and ideas around that rule. They make this rule super strict. They don't want to even leave a tiny crack open for the idea of God or miracles. Because if they did, the normal rules of how the world works might suddenly break, and that would mess everything up. So that was a fairly long quote. I'm going to just extract a couple things. Is that scientists have already decided that everything in the world is made only of stuff we can touch, measure, and see. And one might also add that it's not only the stuff, it's the processes. So when I talk about undirected macroevolution, when I look at the processes that exist today or have existed through documented history, I would say those are the only processes we can bring to bear. So if we were to talk about directed macroevolution, I would say I don't see any direction happening now, therefore the direction can never happen. If we were to talk about aliens, I could say I don't see aliens, so then they can't be part of the solution. And most certainly we can't talk about God because God isn't even in our own realm of physicality. Okay, so let's go to the real, actual, meaty quote. This is by Richard Lewontin, a 1997 article in the New York Review of Books. He says, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense, again, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs. That's pretty strong, patent absurdity. In spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories. Let me paraphrase that. In spite of the tolerance of the scientific community to made up stories without evidence. Because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. Paraphrased, we have a bias that all answers must align with materialism. He continues, it is not the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. This is, again, transparency, authenticity, how somebody actually sees things. This is a very insightful a quote. So he says that the scientific community has a commitment to materialism, meaning that explanations can only involve matter. This is a bias that is introduced. There is no justification in the scientific process for this. It's a bias they bring to the scientific process, no matter how counterintuitive. So there's a bias that only matter can form an explanation in science. Now, let's just say, for example, aliens exist or God exists. That excludes answers that may be valid.